Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into the dusty, sometimes baffling archives of history. Pulling back the velvet curtain on how women's anxiety was understood, misdiagnosed, and treated through the ages. Imagine, if you will, a flickering gas lamp casting long shadows across a Victorian drawing room, the air thick with the scent of lavender and regret. Cast your mind back to Mesopotamia, to Egypt, to the early Greek city-states. Like something out of a low-budget horror film where your internal organs decide to play hide-and-seek. But for millennia, this was a mainstream historical fact, widely accepted by physicians and lay people alike. The symptoms attributed to this peripatetic organ were vast and varied. Everything from mild irritability and tearfulness to convulsions, paralysis, and even death. The treatments, as you might imagine, were equally imaginative and often, well, a little smelly. To entice the womb back to its rightful place, physicians would try to lure it with pleasant smells, applied to the vaginal area, while simultaneously repelling it from the upper body with foul odors. Yes, you'd be sitting there, maybe having a perfectly normal day, and suddenly, boom, doctor is waving some truly pungent stuff under your nose, all in the name of coaxing your uterus to behave. It makes you wonder if some women just pretended to feel better to get the smell to go away. Here, long before anyone uttered the word psychology, a peculiar and rather enduring theory about women's anxieties took root: the wandering womb. Was it genuinely believed, or was it a convenient way to dismiss and contain female distress, attributing it to a runaway organ rather than any external stressors or societal pressures? You find yourself considering the implications of such a belief system. If your anxiety stemmed from an organ literally doing laps inside you, then perhaps you weren't truly ill in the same way a man might be. You were just, well, female. This quirky tidbit, the wandering womb, truly sets the stage for the long winding and often frustrating history of how society has grappled with women's inner turmoil. It's a reminder that even the most seemingly outlandish theories can hold sway for centuries, shaping lives and defining destinies. And as you ponder the sheer absurdity of a uterus on vacation, you realize just how far we still have to go in understanding the complexities of the human mind and body for everyone. Yes, you heard that right. The uterus, that vital organ, was believed to be a restless, almost sentient entity, capable of detaching itself and roaming freely throughout the female body. Think of it as a mischievous internal rogue on a grand tour, bumping into organs, causing blockages, and generally wreaking havoc wherever it pleased. When it wandered too high, pressing against the diaphragm, it caused shortness of breath, a feeling of suffocation, and a general sense of unease. When it settled near the head, it brought on headaches, dizziness, and fits. This was, in essence, the earliest documented explanation for what we now understand as anxiety, panic attacks, and a whole host of other conditions, all neatly packaged under the umbrella term of hysterics. A woman reclines, pale and delicate, a lace handkerchief pressed to her forehead. Or perhaps you're transported even further back, to a sun-baked marketplace in ancient Rome, where a nervous cough might be interpreted as a sign of ill humors. You're not just listening, you're there, feeling the oppressive weight of societal expectations, the phantom pains of mysterious ailments, and the bewildering array of cures that often did more harm than good. You probably won't survive this journey with your modern sensibilities entirely intact, but you'll certainly gain a new appreciation for how far we've come. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling chatty, Drop a comment below with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins, as many fascinating yet slightly uncomfortable historical tales do, in the hazy mists of ancient civilizations. It sounds utterly ridiculous to our modern ears, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether these ancient beliefs were purely physiological or if they served a deeper social function, subtly reinforcing patriarchal control by framing female emotionality as a biological flaw unique to women. Building upon the foundations laid by earlier civilizations, the ancient Greeks, those titans of philosophy and medicine, inherited and expanded upon the concept of the wandering womb. However, their understanding of health and illness was largely framed by the theory of the four humors: blood, bile, black bile, and phlegm. You imagine yourself in a bustling Greek agora, the air filled with philosophical debate and the scent of olives, as a learned physician explains that true health for both men and women depended on a delicate balance of these internal fluids. One suggested remedy for hysteria was marriage, or more specifically, frequent sexual intercourse. The idea was that sexual activity would purge the womb and prevent it from wandering, thus settling the female constitution. You might scoff, but for centuries, it was a genuinely prescribed medical intervention for what we now understand as anxiety and depression. Imagine going to the doctor and being told, "Well, my dear, what you need is a good spouse and some conjugal visits." It certainly puts a different spin on dating advice. When one humor became too dominant or too deficient, illness ensued. Or if it was another means of social control reinforcing patriarchal norms by positioning women as inherently unstable and requiring male oversight either through marriage or medical intervention, was it truly about healing or about maintaining order? The lines, as you can see, are often blurred. You find yourself pondering how deeply ingrained these ancient ideas became, shaping the perception of women's mental and emotional lives for centuries to come. The notion that a woman's emotional state was fundamentally linked to her reproductive organs, rather than her experiences or environment, would prove to be a remarkably persistent, if often frustrating, legacy. It's a good thing we've moved past the idea of our organs playing musical chairs inside us, right? For women, however, there was an added layer of complexity, a persistent belief in their inherent female imbalance. This wasn't just about an imbalanced humor. It was about the very nature of being female. Women were considered to be naturally cooler and wetter than men, their bodies less robust, more susceptible to fluctuations. This physiological difference, it was believed, made them particularly vulnerable to emotional and nervous complaints. So while a man might suffer from an excess of black bile leading to melancholy, a woman's equivalent distress would often be attributed directly to her sex, a fundamental flaw in her physiological makeup. It's like being told your car is constantly breaking down, not because of a faulty part, but because it's, well, your car. This inherent fragility was a mainstream historical fact, deeply woven into medical texts and societal expectations. The Greek physician Hippocrates, often hailed as the father of medicine, despite his rather interesting ideas about female anatomy, played a significant role in solidifying these theories. He, too, believed the uterus could roam, leading to symptoms he termed hysteric suffocation, essentially a panic attack caused by the uterus pressing on vital organs. His remedies, while perhaps less pungent than the Egyptian ones, still aimed to coax the uterus back into place. Think less crocodile dung and more gentle fumigation, or the application of foul-smelling pessaries. Imagine a garlic clove, but for internal use, for therapeutic purposes, not for seasoning your insides, thankfully. It's enough to make you grateful for modern medicine, where a simple pill or a chat with a therapist is usually the first line of defense, not an internal herb garden. This peculiar belief in the wandering womb, coupled with the humoral theory, led to a pervasive understanding that women's distress was fundamentally different from men's. It's often more irrational, more tied to their reproductive organs than to their minds. This emphasis on the uterus as the source of female anxiety also led to some quirky or fringe tidbits in terms of treatment. Historians still argue whether the medicalization of female anxiety in this way was a genuine attempt to understand women's health. As the torch of civilization passed from ancient Greece to the mighty Roman Empire, so too did some of the medical theories, though with a distinct Roman pragmatism. You find yourself now in a grand Roman bathhouse, the steam rising, the air heavy with the scent of oils and minerals. Unlike the more philosophical Greeks, the Romans were master engineers and administrators in their approach to health. While still incorporating elements of the humoral theory and the wandering womb, often leaned towards more practical, physical interventions. This included herbal infusions, often made from calming plants like chamomile or valerian, which, interestingly, are still used today. Amethyst, for instance, was thought to ward off intoxication and calm the mind, while jade was associated with tranquility. Did these therapies genuinely address underlying psychological distress? Or did they merely offer temporary symptomatic relief, masking deeper issues that were yet to be conceptualized? You ponder the effectiveness of these soothing rituals. While they likely provided comfort and perhaps some physiological benefits, they didn't really delve into the root causes of anxiety, still compared to the more invasive or odorous treatments of earlier times. A good bath and some herbal tea probably felt like a spa day. You can almost feel the warm water enveloping you, washing away the stresses of the ancient world. It's a gentle pause before the stormier approaches to come. You might chuckle, but imagine the comfort a person might derive from wearing a beautiful stone, believing it offered protection against their inner turmoil. It speaks to a deep human need for external anchors when facing internal struggles, a desire for something tangible to ward off the intangible. It's the ancient equivalent of carrying a stress ball or a lucky charm, just a bit shinier and perhaps less squishy. They also prescribe dietary changes, rest, and even specific types of exercise, often gentle walks or light physical activity. The idea was to restore equilibrium to the body and mind, though the underlying belief in the inherent fragility of the female constitution persisted. Women were still seen as more susceptible to emotional disturbances, and their reproductive organs continued to be implicated in their nervous complaints, though perhaps with less emphasis on the uterus literally scampering about the torso. For Roman women suffering from what we would now recognize as anxiety, the emphasis was frequently on bathing, gentle exercise, and a variety of soothing remedies designed to restore balance and calm the agitated body. Think of it, instead of complex philosophical debates about humors, you'd be prescribed a leisurely soak in the thermal springs, known for their healing properties. These baths were not just for hygiene. They were social hubs, places of relaxation, and integral to Roman medical practice. The warmth of the water, the soothing movements of attendants performing gentle massages, and the overall atmosphere of calm were believed to alleviate nervous tension. This was a mainstream historical fact, the therapeutic power of water deeply embedded in Roman life. Imagine the steam, the hushed murmurs, the feeling of weightlessness as you float in the warm water, perhaps with some fragrant oils gently rubbed into your skin. It sounds rather pleasant, actually, especially compared to some of the earlier cures. Beyond the baths, Roman physicians employed a range of other gentle remedies. One quirky or fringed tidbit from this era involves the use of certain precious stones worn as amulets or ground into powders and consumed, believed to possess calming properties. Historians still argue whether the Roman emphasis on physical treatments was a true advancement in understanding anxiety, or simply a more pragmatic, less speculative approach to symptoms that were still fundamentally misunderstood. As the Roman Empire faded and the medieval period dawned across Europe, a profound shift occurred in the understanding of women's anxieties. You find yourself now in a dimly lit, cold medieval village, the air heavy with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. The sophisticated medical theories of the Greeks and Romans largely receded, replaced by a worldview dominated by the church and a burgeoning belief in demonic influence. These were often passed down through generations, rooted in local traditions, herbal knowledge, and a blend of superstition and practical wisdom. If someone suddenly fell ill with unexplained trembling, weakness, or a sense of dread, it might be attributed to an invisible arrow shot by mischievous elves or fairies. The cure often involves specific rituals, incantations, or the application of elf-shot stones, prehistoric arrowheads, believed to be the actual weapons used by these mythical beings. You can almost picture the scene, a distraught family bringing their trembling daughter to a wise woman, who then rubs an ancient stone over her body, whispering ancient words. It's a fascinating blend of the magical and the mundane, demonstrating how pre-scientific societies attempted to make sense of suffering. While not always effective, they often provided comfort and a sense of agency in a world where explanations for illness were scarce. Or if it was a deliberate, albeit unconscious tool for reinforcing social hierarchies and controlling perceived female deviance. Did it empower women by giving them a divine reason for their suffering? Or did it further marginalize them by labeling their emotional struggles as moral failings? You contemplate the weight of this era, where the solace of faith could also be the source of profound terror, and where a troubled mind might lead not to a physician, but to an exorcist. It's a chilling reminder of how vulnerable people were to the prevailing narratives of their time, especially when grappling with the unseen complexities of the human psyche. Think of poultices made from soothing herbs, concoctions brewed from specific plants gathered under the light of a certain moon, or charms and amulets worn for protection. These weren't necessarily medical interventions in the modern sense, but rather a community's attempt to grapple with the inexplicable. You might see a woman carrying a small bag of dried lavender, or wearing a specific knot of string, hoping it would ward off the bad spirits that caused her tremors. It's like today, when someone sips chamomile tea for nerves, but with a much more mystical and less scientifically proven rationale behind it. No longer was a wandering womb the primary culprit for a woman's distress. Instead, her anxieties, her melancholies, her strange behaviors were often attributed to spiritual failings, sin, or most terrifyingly, the direct intervention of evil spirits. This was a mainstream historical fact that permeated every aspect of life. If a woman experienced fits, uncontrollable weeping, or severe depression, it wasn't a physiological imbalance, but potentially a sign of demonic possession or temptation. The medical profession, such as it was, became deeply intertwined with religious doctrine. Priests and exorcists often held as much, if not more, sway than the local village healer when it came to addressing these perceived spiritual ailments. You can imagine the fear this instilled, the profound sense of guilt and shame that must have accompanied such a diagnosis. It wasn't just a physical discomfort, it was a perceived attack on your very soul. Alongside the religious interpretations, however, persisted a rich tapestry of folk cures. One quirky or fringe tidbit from this era is the belief in elf-shot as a cause of various ailments, including anxiety-like symptoms. Historians still argue whether the increased emphasis on spiritual causes for women's distress during the medieval period was a natural evolution of belief systems. Emerging from the long shadows of the medieval period, you now step into the vibrant, burgeoning light of the Renaissance. Imagine the burst of artistic expression, the rediscovery of classical texts, and a renewed fascination with the human form. This era, stretching roughly from the 14th to the 17th century, marked a significant shift away from purely spiritual explanations for illness, slowly, painstakingly moving towards a more empirical understanding of the body. Baths, gentle exercise, and herbal preparations continued to be prescribed. The idea was that a strong, unpleasant smell would shock the system and clear the congested pathways. Did a more detailed understanding of the body lead to more effective interventions? Or did it merely confirm existing biases about female frailty through a different lens? You consider how tantalizingly close, yet frustratingly far, they were from a holistic understanding. While the wandering womb might have been slightly less nomadic, the idea that a woman's emotional state was dictated by her reproductive system remained firmly entrenched. The seeds of modern scientific inquiry were being planted, but the garden of understanding was still quite wild and untamed. So if you were a lady of means, feeling a bit faint from your restrictive corsetry, or simply overwhelmed, a servant might rush over with a vial of potent smelling salts, practically shoving them up your nose. It was certainly effective at waking you up, even if it didn't address the underlying cause of your anxiety. It's a bit like someone blasting a foghorn to get your attention, rather than just gently tapping you on the shoulder. You might find a woman being given a soothing tisane made from melissa or borage, known for their calming properties, or perhaps advised to take gentle walks in a garden, enjoying the beauty of nature. The emphasis was still largely on restoring physical balance, as the concept of mental illness as a distinct entity was still centuries away. The connection between mind and body was acknowledged, but the body was usually seen as the primary driver of emotional states, not the other way around. There was a burgeoning interest in anatomy, driven by pioneering figures like Leonardo da Vinci and Andreas Vesalius, who meticulously dissected cadavers to map the intricate workings of human physiology. This was a mainstream historical fact that began to chip away at centuries of superstition. For women suffering from anxiety, this meant a slight, almost imperceptible, shift in perspective. While the concept of the wandering womb hadn't entirely vanished, told ideas die hard. After all, the new anatomical studies began to offer alternative explanations for various physical and mental ailments. Physicians, now armed with a more detailed understanding of organs and their connections, started to look beyond purely spiritual or humoral imbalances. They still linked female distress to the reproductive system, but it was less about a uterus on a joyride, and more about supposed vapors or suffocations of the mother, caused by congestion or blockages within the female body. It was a step, however small, towards a more physiological, albeit still flawed, understanding. This period saw the gradual re-emergence of some of the more practical, ancient Roman-style remedies, though often with a Renaissance flair. One quirky or fringe tidbit from the Renaissance involved the use of powerful smelling salts, or pungent vinegars, to revive women suffering from fainting spells or fits, often attributed to these aforementioned vapors. Historians still argue whether the anatomical discoveries of the Renaissance genuinely improved the treatment of women's anxiety, or if they simply provided a new pseudoscientific veneer for old prejudices. As the Renaissance bloomed, casting a light on anatomy and humanism, an ominous shadow began to lengthen across Europe, particularly affecting the perception and treatment of women's anxieties. The era of the witch hunts. You now find yourself in a chilling, paranoid landscape where a woman's distress, her unusual behavior, or even her outspokenness could lead to accusations of sorcery. In a society deeply steeped in superstition and religious dogma, these symptoms were often interpreted not as illness, but as evidence of a pact with the devil. Her fear, her erratic movements, her despondency could all be twisted into signs of demonic possession or malevolent magic. These were often ordinary bottles filled with items like hair, fingernail clippings, urine, pins. Was the accusation of witchcraft merely a convenient label for behaviors that were misunderstood or deemed unacceptable, particularly in women? You reflect on the sheer injustice and cruelty of this era, where the very act of struggling with one's mental health could lead to unimaginable suffering. The ghost of the wandering womb might have still lingered in some medical texts, but the pervasive terror of the witch hunts eclipsed all other explanations, offering a chilling reminder of how societal anxieties can be projected onto and persecute the most vulnerable members. It makes you grateful that your biggest worry about strange behaviors is usually just being caught dancing badly in public, not being accused of brewing potions, and herbs then buried near the hearth or under the doorstep of a house, believed to absorb malevolent magic directed at the occupants. While not a direct treatment for anxiety, the very existence of such practices speaks volumes about the level of fear and the desperate measures people took to protect themselves from unseen forces, including those thought to be wielded by witches. It's a bit like creating a DIY Faraday cage for your anxieties, but with more bodily fluids and sharp objects involved. This created an incredibly hostile environment where genuine suffering was pathologized, not as a physical ailment, but as spiritual evil. It's like being terrified of public speaking, and then being told that your sweaty palms and racing heart mean you reworking for the Dark Lord. Not exactly a comforting diagnosis. This was a mainstream historical fact, and terrifying period from the 15th to the 18th centuries, where societal fear and religious fervor converged, making female vulnerability a dangerous liability. Imagine the pervasive terror, a woman suffering from what we now recognize as severe anxiety, perhaps experiencing hallucinations, delusions, or uncontrollable tremors. The trials themselves were often rigged, designed to extract confessions through torture, further exacerbating the mental and physical torment of the accused. Women already considered the weaker vessel, and more susceptible to temptation due to prevailing theological interpretations, were disproportionately targeted. Their emotional states, their anxieties, their moments of despair could easily be weaponized against them. This profound societal fear manifested in horrifying ways, turning communities against their own, often targeting vulnerable, marginalized, or simply eccentric women. It was a time when showing any sign of mental distress could literally cost you your life. One quirky or fringed tidbit from this period is the use of witch bottles or patropaic objects to ward off supposed curses or evil influences. Historians still argue whether the witch hunts were primarily driven by genuine religious fanaticism, by socioeconomic pressures, or by a misogynistic desire to control and subjugate women who deviated from societal norms. Emerging from the dark shadows of the witch hunts, you find yourself propelled into the age of reason, the Enlightenment. Imagine grand salons filled with the scent of coffee and intellectual fervor. where philosophers and scientists debated the nature of humanity, society, and the universe. Physicians began to observe that certain physical symptoms, including those associated with anxiety, seemed to stem from the nerves themselves. They started to conceptualize a network of delicate fibers throughout the body. Carrying sensations, he believed in a universal and visible fluid that connected all living things, and that illness resulted from blockages or imbalances in this fluid, or if it simply replaced one form of medicalized sexism with another, albeit more scientifically couched explanation for their supposed fragility. Did it genuinely advance the understanding of anxiety, or did it merely provide a new framework for controlling and defining female emotionality? You consider the paradox, an era championing reason, yet still struggling to apply that reason without bias to half of the population. The nervous system was now on the table, but the table itself was still tilted. He would conduct elaborate sessions where he would pass his hands over patients, often women, or have them sit around a baquet, to redistribute this magnetic fluid, while later debunked as pseudoscience. These sessions often had a powerful suggestive effect in many patients, particularly those suffering from anxiety or vague nervous complaints, reported feeling better. It was the original good vibes only approach, but with more theatrics and arguably less actual magnetism and impulses, and when these nerves became overstimulated or disordered, they could lead to a variety of complaints. This marked a crucial step towards understanding anxiety as a physiological rather than purely spiritual or reproductive phenomenon. It was still a nascent understanding, mind you, a bit like trying to figure out how a complex computer works by just looking at the wires, but it was a start. This era, roughly the 17th and 18th centuries, marked a significant intellectual shift. Moving away from supernatural explanations and towards rational inquiry and observation, doctors would now inquire about a patient's nervous constitution or their sensibility. Women, however, still bore the brunt of these new theories in a particular way. While the overall emphasis was on rational thought and scientific observation, the prevailing societal view was that women were inherently more delicate and therefore possessed a more sensitive, easily agitated nervous system. Their emotions were often seen as more volatile, their minds more prone to imaginative flights that could lead to nervous disorders. So, while progress was being made, the shadow of female vulnerability still lingered, just rephrased in scientific terms. For the first time, there was a growing fascination with the nervous systems and the intricate workings of the human body and mind, beginning to lay the groundwork for modern neurology and psychology. This was a mainstream historical fact, a seismic shift in how people understood themselves. Think of it. Instead of demons or wandering organs, thinkers like Descartes proposed a dualistic view, separating mind from body, but acknowledging their interaction. The focus shifted towards understanding the mechanics of the body. One quirky or fringe tidbit from the Enlightenment era involves the fascination with animal magnetism or mesmerism, popularized by Franz Mesmer. Historians still argue whether the Enlightenment's focus on the nervous system truly liberated women from older, more superstitious diagnoses. As the Enlightenment gave way to the 19th century, you find yourself transported to the rigid, often stifling world of the Victorian era. Imagine drawing rooms heavy with velvet, the air thick with unspoken anxieties, and the pervasive scent of camphor and worry. If a woman experienced fatigue, nervousness, headaches, or even vague feelings of discontent, symptoms we now easily identify as anxiety or depression, she was often diagnosed with neurasthenia or hysteria. You picture it. A woman, typically well-to-do, confined to bed for weeks, even months, completely isolated from family. Many of these nerve tonics or female compounds contained alarming amounts of alcohol, opium, or cocaine, offering temporary symptomatic relief but leading to addiction. You might see an advertisement depicting a pale, languishing woman suddenly vibrant after taking a spoonful of Dr. Williams' pink pills for pale people.
Ow.
Unaware she was essentially medicating herself into a daze with a highly addictive substance. It was a quick fix that often created a bigger problem, much like trying to patch a leaky roof with a single piece of tape. And friends, forbidden from reading, writing, or engaging in any stimulating activity, genuinely reflected the understanding of female physiology at the time, or if it served as a means of social control, reinforcing traditional gender roles. By keeping women confined to the domestic sphere and preventing them from challenging societal norms, was it a misguided attempt at healing, or a convenient way to subdue female ambition and discontent? You consider the profound psychological toll this enforced idleness must have taken, often exacerbating the very anxieties it sought to alleviate. It truly encapsulates an era where women's mental health is often seen through the lens of their perceived fragility and need for containment. Her diet would be restricted often to milk, and she would receive daily massages and electrotherapy, mild electric shocks meant to stimulate her muscles. The idea was to completely remove all external stimuli, allowing her overwrought nervous system to recuperate. It sounds less like a cure and more like a very dull, albeit well-intentioned, form of solitary confinement. Imagine being told your cure for stress is to do absolutely nothing indefinitely, while someone occasionally zaps you. Fun. The prevailing medical theory, still influenced by the idea of delicate female nerves, suggested that women's brains and bodies were simply not equipped to handle the stresses of modern life, let alone intellectual pursuits or too much social excitement. It was almost as if their minds were fine china, prone to shattering if jostled too much. This period, from roughly 1837 to 1901, became particularly infamous for its approach to women's mental distress. It's often characterized by the widespread diagnosis of invalidism and the notorious rest cure. This was a mainstream historical fact, a defining feature of how female anxiety was understood and managed. For Victorian women, particularly those of the middle and upper classes, being deemed an invalid was almost a status symbol, a paradoxical badge of their delicate sensibilities and refined nature. The prescribed solution for these nervous conditions was often the rest cure. Popularized by American neurologist Silas Weir Mitchell, one quirky or fringe tidbit from this era relates to the proliferation of patent medicines, often heavily advertised and promising miraculous cures for female complaints. Historians still argue whether the rest cure and the concept of invalidism it supported. Still immersed in the suffocating atmosphere of the Victorian era, your attention is now drawn to a particular fashion accessory that, while seemingly innocuous, played a significant, if insidious, role in women's health and the perception of their fragility. The corset. Imagine a woman meticulously lacing herself into this rigid garment, her breath catching, her organs compressed, all in the pursuit of the coveted hourglass figure. The immediate effects were obvious: difficulty breathing, fainting spells, indigestion, and muscular atrophy. But the long-term impact was far more severe, ranging from displaced organs and spinal deformities to chronic pain and reduced lung capacity. These were often slightly looser or designed with elastic inserts, claiming to offer the desired silhouette without the extreme constriction. However, the prevailing fashion ideal often trumped health concerns. and many women continued to wear traditional, tightly laced corsets. You can almost hear the whispered complaints among women, traded behind gloved hands, about the discomfort. The inability to breathe deeply, the constant pressure, yet the social pressure to conform to the ideal was immense, a silent source of anxiety in itself. When a woman experienced shortness of breath or lightheadedness, symptoms often associated with anxiety, was frequently attributed to her delicate constitution or nervousness, rather than the literal squeezing of her internal organs. Did the corset contribute to the perception of female fragility by physically weakening them, thus making them more susceptible to diagnoses like neurasthenia? You ponder the sheer irony. A garment meant to make a woman proper and beautiful, simultaneously rendered her physically vulnerable and inadvertently prone to the very symptoms for which she might then be prescribed a rest cure or other restrictive treatments. The physical constraints imposed by fashion reflected, and perhaps amplified, the societal constraints placed on women's minds and spirits. It's like complaining about a headache after repeatedly hitting yourself with a hammer and blaming it on your fragile skull. This practice of tight lacing was a mainstream historical fact, an almost universal aspect of female dress for centuries, but particularly restrictive during the Victorian period, directly contributing to many of the physical constraints and perceived ailments of women. You see her, standing before a mirror, a maid or companion pulling the laces, until her waist is cinched to an alarmingly small circumference. The medical community of the time was divided on corsets. Some physicians condemned them as detrimental to health, causing hysteria and general debility, while others, oddly enough, prescribed them as a means of supporting a weak female constitution, or even to cure. A wandering womb, yes, that idea still lingered, albeit in a more subdued form, suggesting the corset could hold the uterus in place. This contradiction highlights the prevailing confusion and lack of understanding surrounding women's bodies. The very garment designed to enhance feminine beauty also served as a physical constraint that could exacerbate, or even directly cause, symptoms interpreted as anxiety. One quirky or fringe tidbit from this era is the invention of health corsets, or hygienic corsets, by reformers. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of corsets was primarily a fashion trend, a symbol of societal expectations for female appearance, or a tool for further control of women's bodies. Moving deeper into the Victorian labyrinth of female anxieties, you encounter another prevalent, yet often dangerous, approach to managing distress: the widespread use of opium and its derivatives, particularly laudanum. Imagine a mother, worn down by societal pressures and chronic ailments, quietly pouring a few drops of a dark, viscous liquid into her tea, seeking a momentary respite from her nervous complaints. It was cheap, legal, and easily accessible, sold in pharmacies, grocery stores, and even by traveling peddlers. Many women, seeking relief from genuine suffering, inadvertently became addicted, leading to a cycle of dependence that only exacerbated their underlying anxieties and created new ones. Doctors, largely unaware of the long-term dangers of addiction, continued to prescribe it liberally, believing they were offering genuine therapeutic help, or if it served as another subtle form of social control, keeping women docile and compliant by dulling their senses and suppressing any potential challenges to their prescribed roles. Did it offer genuine relief from unmanageable pain and anxiety, or did it merely drug women into accepting their restrictive lives? You contemplate the tragic irony. Women seeking solace from their internal turmoil found it in a bottle that ultimately bound them even tighter, silencing their anxieties at the cost of their freedom and well-being. The relief was temporary, the chains often permanent. It was a classic case of unknowingly swapping one problem for a far more insidious one, much like fixing a leaky faucet by just letting the entire house flood. You can almost picture the small, dark bottles on the mantelpiece of many a Victorian home, right next to the cough syrup and the digestive bitters, for women suffering from chronic pain, menstrual issues, or the nebulous anxieties of the air, those vague feelings of discontent and unease that had no other name. Laudanum offered a powerful, if temporary, escape. It numbed the senses, quieted the racing mind, and induced a state of blissful detachment. It was the ultimate off switch for an overstimulated nervous system, or so they believed. These potent substances were not only readily available, but were often prescribed by doctors as soothing elixirs for a myriad of conditions, including anxiety, insomnia, and general nervousness. This was a mainstream historical fact, a common household remedy and medical treatment. Laudanum, an alcoholic tincture of opium, was a true Victorian panacea. The problem, of course, was the highly addictive nature of opium. One quirky or fringe tidbit from this period is the surprising social acceptance of opiate use among women, particularly middle and upper class women. Unlike alcohol, which was seen as a male vice and a sign of moral degradation, laudanum use among women was often viewed sympathetically, a mark of their delicate constitution and sensitivity to the trials of life. It was considered a genteel way to manage distress, far less scandalous than overt drunkenness. You can imagine hushed conversations about a neighbor's nervous constitution requiring her daily dose of drops, with little to no judgment attached. It highlights a fascinating double standard in Victorian society regarding acceptable forms of escapism. Historians still argue whether the widespread prescription of opium to women is a genuine medical attempt to alleviate suffering in an era of limited understanding. Still deeply entrenched in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, you now turn your gaze to one of the most enduring and pervasive diagnostic labels in the history of women's health: female hysteria. Imagine a medical textbook from this era, filled with detailed descriptions of symptoms so broad they encompassed virtually every female complaint imaginable. From mild irritability and tearfulness to fainting spells, insomnia, and even paralysis, this umbrella diagnosis, a mainstream historical fact, became the default explanation for countless women experiencing anxiety, depression, and a host of other psychological and physical ailments, often serving as a tool for male control within the medical sphere. Beyond the famous vibrators were devices like suspension chairs or gyroscopic chairs where women would be spun rapidly to shake up their nervous systems and supposedly realign their bodies. Or if it was predominantly a reflection of societal anxieties about female autonomy and a means of controlling women by medicalizing their dissent and distress. Did it provide a framework for understanding, however flawed? Or did it primarily serve to reinforce patriarchal power dynamics by delegitimizing female emotionality? You consider the profound power imbalance inherent in this diagnostic label, where a woman's agency could be stripped away simply by a doctor's pronouncement that she was hysterical. It's a stark reminder of how medical labels can shape lives, for better or, in this case, often for worse. You can almost picture a distraught woman being strapped into a spinning machine, hoping it would literally jolt her back to sanity. It speaks volumes about the desperation for cures and the lack of truly effective treatments beyond rest and sedatives. It's like trying to fix a complex software bug by just violently shaking your computer. The term hysteria itself, as you might recall, harkens back to the ancient Greek concept of the wandering womb. While the literal belief in a uterus traipsing through the body had largely faded, the association of female emotional and nervous disorders with the reproductive system remained stubbornly entrenched. Hysteria became a catch-all diagnosis, applied to any woman whose symptoms didn't fit neatly into other categories, or whose behavior deviated from societal expectations of feminine decorum. If a woman expressed discontent with her domestic role, pursued intellectual endeavors deemed too taxing, or simply seemed too emotional, she might be labeled hysterical. It was effectively the medical equivalent of saying, "It's not you, darling. It's your pesky womanly parts acting up." The symptoms of hysteria were incredibly diverse, making it a remarkably convenient diagnosis for doctors who genuinely struggled to understand complex human behavior. It was said to mimic almost any known disease, manifesting as anything from muscle spasms and numbness to difficulty speaking, vision problems, and chronic fatigue. The very amorphous nature of the diagnosis meant that a woman's genuine suffering, whether physical or psychological, could easily be dismissed as a manifestation of her inherent female condition. This broad diagnosis essentially rendered women's distress illegitimate, often trivializing their experiences and concerns. One quirky or fringe tidbit from this era is the invention of various elaborate, often bizarre contraptions designed to treat hysteria. Historians still argue whether the persistent diagnosis of female hysteria was a genuine attempt by medical professionals to categorize and treat a set of complex symptoms. As the Victorian era gave way to the early 20th century, the growing awareness of nervous disorders and the diagnosis of hysteria led to the development of specific institutions for their treatment. You find yourself now at the gates of an early asylum, a formidable building, perhaps on the outskirts of a bustling city. Its imposing facade, hinting at the complex and often contradictory practices within. These facilities, initially envisioned as places of healing and humane care, represented a mainstream, historical fact in the evolving approach to mental health. It was a macabre form of entertainment, reducing the mentally ill to spectacles. Or if it primarily served as a societal dumping ground for those who didn't fit neatly into prescribed roles, particularly women whose anxieties or eccentricities made them inconvenient or disruptive to their families. Did these institutions offer genuine therapeutic environments, or were they primarily places of containment, especially for women who exhibited behaviors deemed unfeminine or rebellious? You reflect on the complex legacy of these early institutions, a blend of nascent humanitarianism and enduring societal control, where the very act of seeking help often meant relinquishing all personal freedom. Imagine the profound dehumanization of being watched by strangers, your deepest vulnerabilities on display, while later reforms largely ended this practice. Its existence highlights the often stark reality and social perceptions of mental illness at the time. It's like a reality TV show, but with much higher stakes and no actual prize, offering a form of confinement that was often a blend of well-intentioned but ultimately flawed moral treatment. Before the widespread establishment of asylums, individuals with severe mental distress were often left to the care of their families, or worse, confined in prisons, poorhouses, or even chained in basements. The asylum movement, influenced by Enlightenment ideals and the concept of moral treatment, sought to provide a more structured and benevolent environment. While some progressive institutions truly strove for humane care, many quickly became overcrowded, underfunded, and reliant on coercive measures. For women, especially, confinement in an asylum meant a complete loss of autonomy. Their lives were rigidly controlled, their daily activities dictated, their contact with the outside world severely limited. The focus, even in moral treatment, was often on instilling discipline and conformity, rather than exploring the root causes of their anxiety or distress. It's like trying to fix a complex problem by putting it in a box and hoping it sorts itself out without actually looking inside the box. The idea was that removing patients from the stresses of their home lives and placing them in a calm, orderly setting, coupled with routines, fresh air, and manual labor, would aid in their recovery. For women suffering from acute anxiety, severe depression, or what was still broadly termed hysteria, these institutions offered a form of respite, even if it was against their will. However, the reality of these asylums often fell short of their lofty ideals. One quirky or fringe tidbit from this period is the phenomenon of asylum tourism, where curious members of the public, particularly in the earlier days, would pay to visit asylums and observe the patients. Historians still argue whether the advent of the asylum system, particularly for women, represented a step forward in compassionate care, leaving the imposing walls of the early asylum behind. You move into the dawn of the 20th century, a time marked by revolutionary shifts in thought, particularly in understanding the human mind. Here you encounter the profoundly influential, and often controversial, figure of Sigmund Freud and his groundbreaking approach. The talking cure, or psychoanalysis, or spiritual failings and into the complex, often murky terrain of the psyche. He proposed that childhood experiences, repressed memories, and unresolved inner conflicts, particularly those related to sexuality and aggression, could manifest as neurotic symptoms, including anxiety, phobias, and hysteria. While intended to illustrate his theories, the case also highlighted some of the limitations, or if they perpetuated new forms of gender bias by interpreting female anxiety through a Freudian lens that sometimes reduced complex experiences to sexual neuroses. Did the talking cure genuinely unlock deeper truths, or did it merely provide a sophisticated narrative for existing societal anxieties about female sexuality and autonomy? You consider the enduring legacy of psychoanalysis. It opened the door to understanding the mind, but perhaps didn't always fully grasp the complexities of women's lived realities and biases inherent in early psychoanalysis, particularly regarding female sexuality and the dismissal of genuine external factors contributing to a woman's distress. Historians still debate the ethical implications of some of his cases and the extent to which his interpretations imposed his own societal views onto his female patients. It's a reminder that even revolutionary thinkers operate within the confines of their own cultural lens. For women, this was both liberating and at times reconfining. On the one hand, their suffering was no longer solely attributed to their anatomy. On the other, it was often tied to their perceived feminine neuroses, particularly those related to their sexuality. Imagine a dimly lit office in Vienna, a patient reclining on a couch, speaking freely, while a bespectacled doctor listens intently, seeking clues in the hidden depths of the unconscious. This was a mainstream historical fact, a radical departure from previous methods, suggesting that anxiety stemmed from deeply buried unconscious desires and conflicts. Freud's theories were a seismic shift because they moved the locus of mental distress away from simply physical ailments. The core of the talking cure was simple, yet profound, allowing the patient to speak freely, without censorship, about whatever came to mind. Dreams, memories, fantasies. Freud believed that by bringing these repressed thoughts and desires from the unconscious into conscious awareness, the patient could achieve catharsis and insight, thereby alleviating their symptoms. You picture yourself as a patient, perhaps a woman struggling with profound anxiety, finally given a space to voice her innermost fears and frustrations without immediate judgment. A stark contrast to the silence of the rest cure or the constraints of the asylum. It was a painstaking, often years-long process. It's more like untangling a ball of yarn, one thread at a time, rather than just chopping it up. One quirky or fringe tidbit related to Freud's work is his famous case study of Dora, a young woman suffering from hysteria, whose analysis he documented extensively. Historians still argue whether Freud's psychoanalytic theories truly empowered women by giving them a voice and an explanation for their inner turmoil. While Freud was unraveling the unconscious in Vienna, a different, often more physically intrusive, approach to female anxiety and hysteria was gaining traction. Particularly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it was thought that many female nervous conditions, including what we now call anxiety, or even just general discontent, stemmed from a lack of paroxysm, or what was vaguely termed hysterical paroxysm by male physicians. This was a non-specific term that referred to a release of tension, believed to be beneficial for women's health, but as health devices for a variety of female complaints. Did it offer a form of physical release that genuinely helped some women with their symptoms? Or did it further reduce women to their reproductive organs, treating complex anxieties with a simplistic physical intervention? You consider the ethical complexities and the underlying assumptions of female bodies as inherently problematic or needing this kind of release. It's a truly uncomfortable, yet undeniably significant part of the story of how women's anxiety was understood, or rather, fundamentally misunderstood. Advertisements in medical journals and even general publications often highlighted their therapeutic benefits for nervous disorders. It's like buying a power drill for home repairs, only to find out its initial intended use was to relieve your tension headaches. The historical context completely reframes how we view these now commonplace devices. Doctors, often feeling ill-equipped or perhaps uncomfortable with directly engaging in the manual stimulation required to achieve this, began to look for technological solutions. You now find yourself in a bustling, somewhat clinical-looking doctor's office, filled with intriguing and rather peculiar devices. Initially developed as a medical instrument, quickly became a popular tool in doctors' offices, allowing physicians to induce these paroxysms more efficiently and presumably with less personal involvement. You imagine a woman, perhaps suffering from vague aches, pains, or debilitating anxiety, being subjected to a rather clinical pelvic massage. With one of these early, bulky, often steam-powered or battery-operated devices. It was considered a legitimate medical procedure, and some women undoubtedly reported feeling better afterwards. Perhaps due to the temporary physical relief or simply the attention and the placebo effect. It was certainly a lot faster than a several years-long talking cure, though arguably less insightful. Here, you encounter a truly bizarre chapter in medical history. The use of vibrators and pelvic massage as therapeutic interventions for women, alongside other bizarre treatments. This was a mainstream historical fact, the one often discussed with a blend of discomfort and dark humor today. The underlying premise for these treatments, believe it or not, is still rooted in the ancient notion of women's unique sexual and reproductive physiology being the source of their distress. Enter the vibrator. One quirky or fringe tidbit from this era is that these vibrators were widely marketed not as sex toys. Historians still argue whether the medical use of vibrators and pelvic massage for hysteria was a genuine, misguided attempt to alleviate female suffering, or if it was a prime example of patriarchal medicine pathologizing female sexuality and distress. As the early 20th century unfurled, alongside the peculiar medical treatments, a powerful social and political movement began to swell, profoundly impacting perceptions of women and, by extension, their anxieties. The suffrage movement. The suffragists, however, boldly asserted women's intellectual capacity, their right to participate in public life, and their capability for political thought. This direct challenge to patriarchal norms, which had long defined women as emotional, irrational, they claimed that the mental and emotional strain of political participation would literally cause women to descend into madness, leading to widespread societal breakdown. Did gaining the vote fundamentally change how women perceived their own mental health? Or did it merely provide a new arena for their struggles? Consider the immense courage it must have taken to defy centuries of ingrained beliefs and expectations, and the powerful message that collective action sent about female capabilities. The fight for the ballot wasn't a therapy session, but it was undoubtedly a massive step towards recognizing women as fully capable individuals, whose anxieties stemmed from genuine societal pressures, not just faulty biology. Imagine reading pamphlets warning that your brain would simply short-circuit if you tried to understand a ballot paper. It's an almost comical, yet deeply unsettling example of how anxiety was weaponized in political discourse, and in need of male guidance began to subtly, yet powerfully, shift the discourse around female mental health. When women actively demanded the right to vote, to own property, to pursue higher education, it became harder to simply dismiss their anxieties as mere hysteria rooted in an oversensitive womb. You now find yourself amidst bustling street protests, the air thick with passionate speeches and the determined resolve of women fighting for their fundamental rights. You imagine the energy of these women marching, speaking, enduring ridicule and even violence, all while defying the very notion that they were too delicate for public life. This collective assertion of power, while undoubtedly stressful and anxiety-inducing in its own right, has also offered a profound counter-narrative to the prevailing medical and societal dismissal of women's intellectual and emotional resilience. It was about taking control rather than being controlled. This was a mainstream historical fact, a monumental struggle for female agency that, while not directly treating anxiety, fundamentally challenged the societal narratives that had historically fueled it and began to redefine the very notion of female agency and defiance. For centuries, as you've seen, women's lives were largely circumscribed by domesticity, and their emotional distress often attributed to inherent biological flaws or nervous frailty. The very act of campaigning, organizing, publicly challenging the status quo was an exercise in agency that directly contradicted the rest-cure mentality. One quirky or fringe tidbit from this era is how some anti-suffragists actually used the prevailing medical theories of female hysteria and nervous breakdowns to argue against giving women the vote. Historians still argue whether the suffrage movement directly reduced female anxiety by empowering women, or if it simply shifted the nature of those anxieties, placing domestic frustrations with the stresses of public life and political struggle. As the 20th century progressed, the world was plunged into cataclysmic events that reshaped societies and profoundly impacted the human psyche. You find yourself now amidst the chaos and devastation of the world wars. First the Great War, and then the even more expansive Second World War. With men away at the front, women stepped into roles previously deemed unfeminine, working in factories, driving ambulances, nursing the wounded, and managing households often with meager resources. This newfound independence and responsibility, while empowering for many, also came with immense stress. Beyond official channels, Community groups and informal networks played a crucial role in providing emotional solace. Think of knitting circles, victory garden clubs, or local tea gatherings where women could share their worries, anxieties, and grief. These informal support systems, while not medical treatments, offered vital psychological ballast in a time of profound stress. It's like a massive, informal group therapy session, fueled by tea and the shared fear of impending doom. The constant worry about husbands, sons, and brothers on the battlefield, the grim reality of casualty lists, the air raids inadvertently led to a more nuanced understanding of female anxiety. Moving beyond purely physiological or hysterical explanations to acknowledge external stressors, did the shared trauma of war finally legitimize women? This emotional suffering is a natural human response to extraordinary circumstances. Or did it merely provide a new context for older patterns of dismissal and neglect? You consider the enduring psychological scars left by these global conflicts, and how they subtly but powerfully shifted the narrative around who could experience profound anxiety and why. The global stage had shrunk, and suddenly everyone was a player in the drama of anxiety, and the sheer uncertainty of the future created a pervasive undercurrent of anxiety that was both collective and deeply personal. It was like living on a roller coaster that never stopped, with unexpected plunges into terror. Imagine the relentless newsreels, the rationing, the constant fear for loved ones, and the profound social upheaval. These periods, undeniable mainstream historical facts, brought with them unprecedented levels of trauma and unveiled a myriad of hidden anxieties, particularly affecting women on the home front and those serving in various capacities. For women, the wars were a complex mix of new opportunities and immense burdens. While shell shock or combat fatigue became recognized for male soldiers, women's psychological suffering was often less formally acknowledged, or still, at times, dismissed under older, vaguer labels. Yet the symptoms were undeniably present. Pervasive nervousness, insomnia, nightmares, chronic fatigue, and bouts of depression. These anxieties were directly tied to the external realities of war, rather than internal female flaws, although old biases still lingered in some medical circles. The sheer scale of the trauma meant that psychological distress could no longer be easily swept under the rug or solely attributed to individual weakness. One quirky or fringe tidbit from this era relates to the various, often rudimentary forms of psychological support offered to women during wartime. Historians still argue whether the world wars by forcing a societal revaluation of women's capabilities and resilience. With the devastating global conflicts finally drawing to a close, you find yourself in the mid-20th century, specifically the post-war decades of the 1950s and 60s. Imagine a landscape shifting from wartime austerity to an era of burgeoning consumerism, suburban sprawl, and a powerful cultural push towards domesticity. For many women, however, this ideal of idyllic family life and the return to the home came with its own unique set of pressures and a new wave of anxieties often managed through the widespread prescription of tranquilizers and sedatives, without fully informing patients of the addictive nature or long-term side effects. It became common for women to have multiple prescriptions from different doctors, creating a hidden culture of dependence. It was an unspoken coping mechanism, a quiet epidemic happening behind closed doors. Often with the tacit approval of the medical establishment, it's like being given a mute button for your emotions, but without understanding that turning it off entirely leaves you without a voice. This was a mainstream historical fact, leading to a quiet epidemic of prescription drug use among women. Or if it served as a means of social control, keeping women compliant and content within their prescribed domestic roles. Did these drugs offer genuine relief from overwhelming anxiety, or did they merely suppress expressions of discontent that might have otherwise led to social change? You consider the profound quietness these pills imposed, silencing anxieties that might have been legitimate cries for autonomy and recognition. The immediate post-war period saw a powerful societal emphasis on traditional gender roles. Women who had worked in factories or served during the war were often encouraged, implicitly or explicitly, to return to the home, embrace marriage, and raise families. The idealized image of the suburban housewife perfectly coiffed and managing a pristine home became pervasive. Yet, beneath this glossy veneer, many women experienced profound feelings of isolation, boredom, and a sense of unfulfilled potential. The anxieties that arose from this mismatch between societal expectation and personal experience were often dismissed as housewife-esque neurosis, or simply an inability to cope with the joys of domestic life. It was like being given a beautiful empty box and told it should make you happy, even if you longed for what was outside. Rather than addressing the underlying societal pressures or offering psychological support, the medical solution often came in the form of pills. The 1950s and 60s saw the meteoric rise of powerful anxiolytics and sedatives like Miltown and, most famously, Valium. These drugs were heavily marketed by pharmaceutical companies, often specifically targeting women with promises of calmness, contentment, and the ability to cope with the demands of their lives. You can almost see the advertisements in women's magazines. A frazzled woman transforming into a serene homemaker with a single pill. These medications provided a powerful, if temporary, way to manage discontent, effectively dampening anxieties rather than resolving them. One quirky or fringe tidbit from this era is the phenomenon of doctors liberally prescribing mother-esque little helpers. Historians still argue whether the widespread reliance on tranquilizers for women in the post-war era was a genuine medical attempt to alleviate suffering in the absence of more sophisticated psychological therapies. As the mid-20th century deepened, a powerful intellectual and social movement began to challenge the very foundations of how women were perceived, both in society and within the medical establishment. You now find yourself in the midst of fervent discussions, protest marches, and groundbreaking academic works that question long-held assumptions. This was the rise of feminist critiques, a mainstream historical fact that fundamentally re-evaluated patriarchal medicine and its historical treatment of women's anxiety. Imagine women's studies departments emerging in universities, challenging the narrative that had consistently linked female distress to inherent biological flaws or emotional fragility. Feminists argued that much of what was labeled female hysteria, neurasthenia, or even just nervousness was not an individual pathology, but a direct response to oppressive societal conditions. Dissatisfied with the male-dominated medical system, women began to meet informally, sharing their experiences, validating each other's feelings, and initiated a long, slow process of reform that is still ongoing. Did these critiques genuinely shift the understanding of women's anxiety away from pathology and towards social determinants? Or did they simply add another layer of complexity to the existing debate? You consider the profound impact of finally naming the problem, of articulating that the source of anxiety might not be within a woman's body or mind, but in the very fabric of the society around her. It was a crucial turning point, forcing a re-examination of who defines normal and who benefits from the definitions of illness, and collectively realizing that their personal anxieties were, in fact, shared political problems. These groups, while not offering medical treatment, provided immense psychological support and a sense of solidarity. It's like a grassroots rebellion against the medical establishment, powered by shared stories and strong coffee. This seminal work, among others, highlighted how women's legitimate frustrations were often medicalized and pathologized, rather than understood as rational responses to an unfulfilling existence. The concept of female hysteria, as you recall, conveniently explained away female rebellion or emotional expression. The rest cure kept women confined. The widespread prescription of tranquilizers in the post-war era, as we just discussed, dulled discontent. Feminists argued that the medical establishment, perhaps unconsciously, often acted as an agent of social control, diagnosing and treating symptoms that were, in fact, responses to systemic oppression. The feminist argument was clear. If you continually tell half the population they are inherently weak, then limit their opportunities, and then dismiss their resulting distress as a medical condition, you're not treating a disease, you're maintaining a system. The constraints of traditional gender roles, the lack of opportunities, the pressures of domesticity, and the pervasive male-dominated medical system itself were identified as major sources of women's anxiety and depression. It was like finally pointing out that the reason someone felt trapped was because they were, quite literally, in a cage, rather than blaming their inherent claustrophobia. Betty Friedan's influential 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, famously articulated the problem that has no name, describing the widespread, unacknowledged discontent and anxiety felt by many American suburban housewives. These critiques exposed how medical diagnoses had historically served to reinforce societal control over women. One quirky or fringe tidbit that emerged from this period was the growing popularity of women-led self-help groups and consciousness-raising circles. Historians still argue whether the feminist critiques were truly successful in fundamentally altering medical practice, or if they primarily raised awareness. While the feminist movement began to challenge the societal and medical perceptions of women's anxiety, a more stark and often terrifying form of intervention was still in use. A procedure that underscores the desperate and sometimes barbaric measures taken in the name of mental health. You now find yourself in a sterile clinical setting, the air thick with tension. As you witness the controversial practice of electroshock therapy, or ECT, this was a mainstream historical fact, particularly prevalent from the 1940s through the 1960s. A form of controversial intervention primarily used for severe mental illnesses, but often applied to women suffering from profound depression and intractable anxiety. When ECT proved more controllable and arguably safer, it largely replaced insulin shock. The very existence of such drastic methods speaks volumes about the desperation to find solutions for severe mental illness. When understanding was rudimentary, it's a chilling reminder of how far medical science has progressed, both in understanding brain chemistry and in valuing patient comfort and autonomy. Electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, involves passing a carefully controlled electrical current through the brain to induce a brief seizure, or if it was in some instances wielded as a form of coercive control over women who were deemed too emotional or non-compliant. Did it offer genuine, life-saving relief, or did it sometimes silence voices that simply needed to be heard? You ponder the immense ethical dilemmas inherent in such a powerful intervention, particularly when applied in contexts where women's autonomy was already compromised. It remains a stark reminder of the often thorny path of mental health treatment and the ongoing struggle to balance effective intervention with human dignity. The exact mechanisms by which it worked were, and to some extent still are, not fully understood. However, it was observed to be remarkably effective in alleviating severe symptoms of depression and certain psychotic disorders when other treatments failed. For women suffering from debilitating suicidal depression or extreme, intractable anxiety that rendered them catatonic or unresponsive, ECT was sometimes seen as a last resort, a powerful tool to interrupt profound despair. Imagine the sheer terror for the patient and the difficult choices faced by families and doctors in an era with far fewer therapeutic options. However, the history of ECT, especially as applied to women, is fraught with controversy and ethical concerns. In its early days, before the use of muscle relaxants and anesthesia became standard, the procedure was often brutal, leading to violent convulsions, broken bones, and profound fear. Furthermore, there are historical accounts and ongoing debates about whether ECT was sometimes used to control unruly or difficult women who did not conform to societal expectations, rather than solely for severe mental illness. The line between therapeutic intervention and social control could often blur, especially in asylums. It was like trying to fix a complex electrical problem by simply unplugging and replugging everything, often with a large spark. One quirky or fringe tidbit related to ECT is the early experimental use of insulin shock therapy preceding it, where patients were induced into a coma by administering large doses of insulin. Historians still argue whether the application of electroshock therapy to women was a necessary, albeit crude medical tool for severe conditions in a pre-pharmacological era. Continuing our journey through the more challenging and often tragic chapters of mental health history, you now confront one of the most invasive and ethically troubling procedures ever devised: the lobotomy. Imagine a specialized operating theater, not for physical ailments, but for the mind, where a surgeon attempts to alter behavior by severing connections within the brain. This was a mainstream historical fact, particularly popular from the 1940s to the 1960s, a period marked by drastic measures in mental health, often leading to profoundly tragic outcomes. This less invasive, more rapid procedure involved inserting a thin instrument, often resembling an ice pick, through the eye socket and into the brain. Without conventional surgery or even anesthesia in many cases, Freeman famously traveled across the United States in his lobotomobile, performing thousands of these procedures in various institutions. It's a truly horrifying image, a testament to how quickly a radical, unproven procedure could gain traction when desperation outweighed caution. The lobotomy, specifically the prefrontal lobotomy, involved surgically cutting the neural pathways connecting the frontal lobes to other parts of the brain, or if it was another manifestation of societal desire to control and subdue non-conforming or difficult individuals, especially women who challenged traditional roles or were deemed too emotional. Did it ever truly improve lives? Or did it merely create a different form of suffering by robbing individuals of their essence? You consider the profound ethical quandaries inherent in altering the very structure of the brain, and the devastating impact it had on countless lives. A grim chapter in the quest to understand and alleviate mental distress. The theory, however crude, was that by disrupting these connections, obsessive thoughts, severe anxiety, violent impulses, or intractable depression could be alleviated. However, the outcomes were highly variable and often devastating. While some patients did become calmer or less agitated, many were left with flattened emotions, impaired cognitive function, and a permanent loss of their unique personality. The goal was often to make patients more manageable, less of a burden on their families or institutions, rather than to restore them to their full selves. You can almost feel the chilling weight of this procedure, where the very essence of a person could be irrevocably altered, all in the name of a cure. For women, who were often disproportionately diagnosed with severe and intractable nervous disorders, particularly those deemed agitated or unmanageable, lobotomies were sometimes performed as a desperate attempt to restore calm, even if it meant sacrificing much of their personality. It was like trying to fix a noisy engine by ripping out half the components, hoping the quiet was worth the engine no longer running properly. The creator of the procedure, Egas Moniz, even won a Nobel Prize for his work, which, in retrospect, speaks volumes about the desperation for effective treatments for severe mental illness at the time. One quirky or fringe tidbit from this era is the invention of the ice pick lobotomy by American physician Walter Freeman. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of lobotomies, particularly for women, was a consequence of genuine therapeutic intent driven by a lack of alternative treatments. As the mid-20th century deepened, seemingly unrelated medical advancement began to ripple through society, profoundly impacting women's lives and, by extension, introducing a new set of complex anxieties. You now turn your attention to the advent of birth control, specifically the oral contraceptive pill, which became widely available in the 1960s. The arrival of reliable birth control offered women the ability to separate sex from reproduction, to plan their families, and to pursue education and careers outside of the domestic sphere. You picture a young woman in the 1960s, holding a small packet of pills, realizing the immense power and choice it represents, and religious groups to endorse it, often citing moral or health concerns that, in retrospect, were largely unfounded or exaggerated, or if it really exchanged one set of anxieties for another. Did reproductive freedom primarily enhance women's well-being? Or did it subtly create new burdens by placing the sole responsibility for contraception on women and adding layers of complexity to their lives? You consider the profound, multifaceted impact of this tiny pill. A silent revolution that continues to shape women's lives and anxieties even today, in ways both obvious and subtle. There were often hushed debates about whether it would lead to widespread promiscuity or a breakdown of the family unit. You can almost hear the moral panic bubbling in the background as women quietly, but decisively, embraced this transformative technology. It highlights how deeply ingrained societal norms resisted even seemingly beneficial advancements. It was a liberation from the relentless cycle of childbearing that had defined so many female lives. A tangible shift in agency that previous generations could only dream of. Imagine a hushed conversation among friends, quiet revolution taking place in homes across the globe. As women gained unprecedented control over their reproductive lives, this was a mainstream historical fact, ushering in an era of newfound reproductive freedom that paradoxically brought with it both liberation and new anxieties. For centuries, pregnancy was an almost inevitable consequence of marriage and sexual activity, profoundly shaping a woman's life trajectory, her opportunities, and her economic dependence. However, with this newfound freedom came a unique set of pressures and anxieties. The expectation to balance career and family intensified. The traditional roles that, while restrictive, offered a clear path, began to blur. Women now had more choices, but also more responsibility to make those choices. And sometimes, the fear of making the wrong choice, or of not living up to new, equally demanding societal expectations. The sexual revolution, partly enabled by the pill, also introduced anxieties around sexual norms, expectations, and personal safety. It was like suddenly being given the keys to a fast car, but realizing you now had to navigate a complex, unmarked road on your own. One quirky or fringe tidbit from the early days of the pill was the initial reluctance of some. Medical professionals, historians still argue whether the widespread availability of birth control truly liberated women from anxiety. As the 20th century progressed, and women gained more choices regarding their careers and reproductive lives, one role remained consistently central, yet often laden with unspoken burdens: motherhood. Do you now consider the timeless image of a mother, perhaps rocking a baby, tending to a child, or juggling household tasks? Throughout history, and particularly in the modern era, societal expectations surrounding motherhood have created unique and often intense pressures that contribute significantly to women's anxiety. This is a mainstream historical fact, a constant thread woven through the tapestry of female experience. From ancient times, motherhood has been venerated, but also highly scrutinized. Or if it is a deliberate, albeit often unconscious, reinforcement of gender roles that place an undue burden on women. Did the idealization of motherhood truly reflect a societal appreciation? Or did it serve to confine women to the domestic sphere while simultaneously creating an endless source of anxiety about their performance? You consider the immense, often unacknowledged, emotional labor involved in motherhood, and how consistently it has been a wellspring of anxiety, pushing women to the brink of their emotional and physical capacities. The historical spotlight often shines on dramatic events, but sometimes the most profound anxieties are found in the quiet, unrelenting pressures of daily life. In the post-war era, with the return to domesticity, the ideal of the perfect mother became an almost impossible standard. The financial strain of raising a family and the profound loss of personal identity that can sometimes accompany the transition into full-time caregiving. For many women, the joy of motherhood was intertwined with a pervasive, simmering anxiety about whether they were doing enough or doing it right. This was a silent epidemic, often discussed in hushed tones among friends, but rarely acknowledged as a societal burden. Women were expected to be nurturing, endlessly patient, effortlessly manage a household, provide constant emotional support, and perhaps even bake perfect cookies, all while maintaining their composure and beauty. This relentless pursuit of an ideal, often fueled by burgeoning media and advertising, created a profound sense of inadequacy and guilt for many women. It was like being given a blueprint for a perfect house, then realizing you only had a few twigs and some duct tape to build it. The anxiety associated with motherhood is multifaceted. The constant worry about a child's health and well-being, the pressure to conform to ever-shifting parenting trends. One quirky or fringe tidbit from recent history is the rise of highly prescriptive parenting manuals, often contradictory, that added to mothers' anxieties. From scheduled feeding to attachment parenting, each new philosophy brought with it a fresh wave of guilt for mothers who couldn't or didn't want to conform. You can almost see a bewildered new mother poring over a dense book, convinced that a single deviation from its advice would permanently scar her child. It's like being given conflicting instructions for assembling flat-pack furniture. But the furniture is a human being, and the stakes are infinitely higher. Historians still argue whether the increased pressure on mothers in the modern era is a consequence of evolving societal structures. Following closely on the heels of the anxieties surrounding motherhood, you now delve into another significant life stage for women that has historically been fraught with misunderstanding and often intense medicalization: menopause. Imagine a woman in her late 40s or early 50s experiencing a cascade of physical and emotional changes, It's often dismissed or trivialized by a society that valued youth and reproductive capacity above all else. This natural biological process, a mainstream historical fact, has frequently been viewed through a lens of illness, sometimes involving large quantities of specific foods thought to cool the body or balance humors that were believed to be going awry during this life stage. Or if it inadvertently perpetuated anxieties by framing a natural process as a medical problem requiring intervention. Did it improve quality of life for many? Or did it create new pressures to conform to a pharmaceutical solution, adding another layer of medical oversight to women's bodies? You consider the ongoing debate about how to best support women through menopause, acknowledging its biological realities while respecting its natural progression. The journey through female life stages, as you can see, has consistently been punctuated by external interpretations and interventions, often adding to, rather than alleviating, internal anxieties. You might find advice columns from the early 20th century suggesting particular restrictive diets or unusual concoctions to alleviate hot flashes, often with little scientific basis. It's like trying to put out a bonfire with a squirt gun made of celery juice, a decline leading to its medicalization and contributing to significant hormonal shifts and associated anxieties. For centuries, menopause, or the change of life, was poorly understood. Symptoms like hot flashes, insomnia, mood swings, and a general sense of unease were often attributed to everything from nervousness to a moral failing, or even linked to the lingering idea of the wandering womb in earlier eras. While HRT has significant benefits for some women in managing severe symptoms, its widespread promotion often created an implicit message that menopause itself was something to be cured or fixed, rather than a normal, albeit challenging phase of life. This narrative could exacerbate anxiety, making women feel that their natural aging process was a form of illness, requiring intervention to remain normal or feminine. In the 20th century, as medical science advanced, the focus shifted to the hormonal aspect, particularly the decline in estrogen. While this was a crucial scientific discovery, it often led to menopause being treated as a disease requiring intervention rather than a natural life transition. It was like suddenly being told that turning 50 was a medical condition, not just a birthday. The medicalization of menopause often led to a focus on deficiency and a push for solutions, primarily hormone replacement therapy. One quirky or fringe tidbit from historical approaches to menopause involved rather bizarre dietary recommendations. Historians still argue whether the medicalization of menopause, particularly with the advent of HRT, truly empowered women by alleviating distressing symptoms. As we progress further into the 20th and early 21st centuries, the landscape of anxiety, particularly for women, becomes increasingly shaped by powerful external forces. You now turn your attention to the pervasive influence of advertising and the wider media, which relentlessly promote an idealized, often unattainable vision of the perfect woman. Imagine glossy magazine covers, flawless models on television, and the constant barrage of messages about how you should look, act, and feel. This ubiquitous media influence is a mainstream historical fact, actively contributing to and exacerbating female anxieties. By setting impossibly high standards and fostering a relentless culture of comparison, while superficially promoting health, these movements often pushed extreme and unhealthy body ideals, contributing to body image anxiety and eating disorders among women. You can almost feel the insidious pressure emanating from curated feeds, a silent competition to achieve an aesthetic that is often unsustainable and genetically improbable. It's a digital hall of mirrors, reflecting back an increasingly distorted sense of self. From the earliest days of mass media, advertising has expertly tapped into aspirations and insecurities. Is it a reflection of cultural ideals or an active shaper of them, creating new forms of distress? You consider the pervasive nature of these images and messages, seeping into the subconscious, subtly shaping desires, and often generating a quiet, simmering anxiety about falling short. It highlights how the external world, through its curated presentations, can profoundly impact our internal sense of self-worth and peace. The pursuit of perfection, as history shows, is often a direct path to anxiety. For women, this often meant portraying an ideal that was physically flawless, perpetually youthful, effortlessly happy, perfectly balanced between domesticity and outward-facing charm. Whether it was the perfectly coiffed 1950s housewife, the impossibly thin 1990s supermodel, or the eternally radiant social media influencer of today, the message was clear. There's a standard, and you're probably not meeting it. This constant visual and narrative bombardment creates a subtle, yet powerful undercurrent of anxiety, a feeling of inadequacy that can be hard to shake. It's like being in a never-ending beauty pageant, where everyone else seems to have the secret handshake. The media doesn't just sell products, it sells lifestyles, identities, and emotional states. Advertisements for everything from weight loss supplements to anti-aging creams, fashion, and even household cleaners implicitly suggest that if you just buy this, you'll achieve that elusive state of perfection and, by extension, peace of mind. The underlying message is that happiness and freedom from anxiety are commodities that can be purchased, rather than internal states or outcomes of genuine well-being. This creates a relentless pressure to consume, to strive, and to constantly measure oneself against an often realistic ideal. One quirky or fringe tidbit from this era is the emergence of thinspiration and fitspiration movements, particularly with the rise of the internet. Historians still argue whether the media's portrayal of perfect women is a direct cause of increased female anxiety, or if it merely amplifies pre-existing societal pressures and insecurities. Stepping away from the media's relentless pursuit of perfection, you now encounter a counter-movement, a diverse landscape of initiatives aimed at fostering individual resilience and mental well-being. The rise of self-help movements. Imagine bookstore shelves overflowing with titles promising enlightenment. Seminars filled with eager participants seeking personal growth, and a growing emphasis on individual solutions to life's challenges. Instead of relying solely on medical interventions or waiting for societal change, individuals were encouraged to take charge of their own emotional lives. Books, workshops, and eventually online resources offered strategies for managing stress, building self-esteem, setting boundaries, and cultivating positive thinking. From manifestation techniques promising to attract wealth and perfect relationships, to energy healing and dubious dietary fads linked to emotional wellness, the market for quick fixes and spiritual shortcuts boomed. You might come across a book suggesting that your anxiety is simply a lack of abundance mindset, or that you just need to align your chakras while sitting under a pyramid. It highlights the human desire for simple answers to complex problems, even when those answers are about as useful as a chocolate teapot. You can almost feel the initial rush of optimism, the belief that with the right tools and mindset, you could overcome any anxiety, placing undue pressure on women to solve societal issues through personal effort. Did it genuinely reduce anxiety by fostering resilience? Or did it sometimes create new anxieties about personal inadequacy for those who could unachieve the promised transformations? You consider the enduring appeal of the self-help industry, a testament to the persistent human desire for control and meaning in a world that often feels overwhelming. So offering a blend of genuine insight and questionable fads. It was like being handed a metaphorical toolkit for your brain, promising you could fix almost anything if you just followed the instructions. This phenomenon, a mainstream historical fact that gained significant momentum in the late 20th, while it certainly gave many women a sense of control and practical strategies for coping, it could also inadvertently place the blame for anxiety squarely on the individual. If you weren't feeling better, perhaps you weren't trying hard enough, or weren't positive enough. This shift from external causes to internal responsibility could paradoxically create new anxieties about personal failure, especially when structural issues remained unaddressed. It's like being told to build a strong house while living on a fault line. You can build, but the ground beneath you is still shaking. In early 21st centuries, emphasized empowerment and presented mental well-being as something achievable through personal effort and the adoption of specific strategies. For women, who had long been told their anxieties were due to inherent flaws or societal constraints, the self-help movement offered a new narrative, one of personal agency and the ability to choose happiness. This emphasis on individual solutions was both empowering and at times problematic. One quirky or fringe tidbit from the self-help explosion is the proliferation of esoteric or highly generalized advice, sometimes bordering on the nonsensical, marketed as profound wisdom. Historians still argue whether the self-help movement truly empowered women by giving them practical tools for mental well-being, or if it inadvertently contributed to the individualization of systemic problems. Shifting from the often generalized advice of the self-help movement you now encounter, a more rigorous, evidence-based approach to managing anxiety that gained significant traction in the latter half of the 20th century and continues to evolve. Today, modern therapy. Imagine a comfortable, confidential setting where trained professionals guide you through structured techniques designed to reframe thought patterns and alter behaviors. CBT and related therapies provided tools to actively manage symptoms like panic attacks, social anxiety, and obsessive worrying, but then rapidly adapted for anxiety disorders as researchers observed common underlying cognitive distortions. While seemingly straightforward, applying these principles to deeply ingrained anxious patterns required significant innovation and refinement. It's like discovering that a wrench designed for one type of bolt actually works surprisingly well on a whole different set of fasteners, opening up new possibilities. They empowered individuals to understand the mechanisms of their anxiety and to develop coping strategies, rather than simply medicating symptoms or accepting a diagnosis of inherent fragility. Does it empower women to overcome personal distress? Or does it inadvertently shift the focus away from the broader cultural factors that contribute to their mental load? You consider the practical benefits of these therapies. They offer tangible relief and teach valuable skills. They represent a crucial step forward from the more paternalistic or invasive methods of the past, focusing on active engagement and a collaborative approach to mental well-being. It was like finally getting a detailed map and a compass for navigating a confusing landscape. Instead of just being told to find your way, this is a mainstream historical fact, representing a significant advancement. With therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy offering practical, actionable strategies for addressing anxiety, unlike the open-ended nature of early psychoanalysis or the broad promises of some self-help approaches, modern therapies often focus on specific, measurable goals. CBT, for instance, operates on the principle that our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are interconnected. If you can change dysfunctional thought patterns, You can alleviate anxious feelings and behaviors. You picture yourself learning to identify irrational fears, challenge negative self-talk, and gradually confront situations you've been avoiding. It's less about delving into your childhood and more about learning practical skills, like a mental fitness program designed to strengthen your emotional muscles. For women, this shift towards concrete. Skill-based therapies offered a refreshing alternative to historical approaches that often pathologized their emotions or offered vague. One quirky or fringe tidbit from the development of CBT is its origins. In part, from therapies developed for treating depression, historians still argue whether the rise of modern structured therapies truly addresses the systemic causes of women's anxiety, or if it primarily offers individual coping mechanisms that, while effective, don't fundamentally challenge the societal pressures women still face. Concurrent with the evolution of talk therapies, a revolution was quietly brewing in laboratories and pharmaceutical companies, leading to perhaps the most widespread and impactful medical approach to anxiety in recent history. And depression were, at least in part, caused by an imbalance of neurotransmitters in the brain, particularly serotonin. Instead of being told their distress was due to a wandering womb, delicate nerves, or societal discontent, they now had a biological explanation and a tangible solution, with some proponents suggesting they were a cure-all for a vast array of human struggles, not just clinical disorders, or if it inadvertently over-medicalized normal human emotions, leading to an over-reliance on pills rather than addressing psychosocial factors. Did these medications genuinely improve the lives of millions? Or did they subtly reinforce the idea that emotional distress is primarily a chemical problem rather than a response to life circumstances? You consider the profound impact of these tiny pills, which have undeniably brought relief to countless individuals, yet continue to spark debate about the complex interplay between brain chemistry, personal experience, and societal well-being. There was a period of intense public and media fascination, sometimes leading to an oversimplification of complex brain chemistry. You might recall popular articles proclaiming them happiness pills, or suggesting they could fundamentally alter personality, leading to unrealistic expectations and sometimes disappointment when they weren't a magic bullet. It's a reminder that even scientific breakthroughs can be swept up in societal hype, much like the craze for new gadgets. This brought a sense of legitimacy to their suffering for many, moving it from the realm of personal failure to a treatable medical condition. It was like finally having a specific key for a specific lock, rather than just jiggling a bunch of random tools. SSR is worked by increasing the amount of serotonin available in the synaptic cleft, thereby improving mood and reducing anxiety. When Prozac, the first widely successful SSRI, was introduced in 1987, it was hailed as a breakthrough. It offered a less sedating, less addictive alternative to the tranquilizers and older antidepressants, and quickly became a go-to treatment for a wide range of anxiety disorders and depression. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief from individuals and doctors alike, finally having a more targeted and seemingly safer pill. You now delve into the age of modern psychopharmacology, specifically the advent of SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Imagine the quiet hum of research facilities, the meticulous trials, and then the slow, deliberate introduction of medications that promise to rebalance the very chemistry of the brain. This was a mainstream historical fact. It's fundamentally altering the landscape of mental health. Treatment, by offering pharmacological solutions based on theories of chemical imbalances. The prevailing scientific theory behind SSR is, which gained prominence in the late 20th century, posited that anxiety for women. The rise of SSR has offered a powerful tool to manage debilitating anxiety that had resisted other forms of treatment. One quirky or fringe tidbit from the early days of SSR was the almost evangelical enthusiasm surrounding them. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of SSR is truly destigmatized women's anxiety by framing it as a biological illness. Moving beyond the realm of traditional Western medicine and self-help fads, you now encounter a growing embrace of diverse approaches that prioritize the interconnectedness of mind, body, and spirit. Imagine tranquil studios filled with soft light, serene natural landscapes, and quiet spaces for reflection. This is the rise of holistic approaches to anxiety, particularly the increasing popularity of practices like yoga and mindfulness. These are mainstream historical facts, representing a significant shift towards complementary therapies and a recognition of ancient wisdom in modern well-being. While some of these practices lack scientific validation, their growing popularity reflects a deep human yearning for connection, meaning, and a gentler, more natural path to well-being. Or if it represents a societal pendulum swing away from the perceived sterility of conventional medicine, sometimes without sufficient scientific rigor. Do these practices truly alleviate anxiety? Or do they primarily offer coping mechanisms and a sense of well-being that complements rather than replaces traditional care? You consider the growing integration of these practices into mainstream wellness, a testament to their perceived benefits and a recognition that the mind and body are inextricably linked. It's a quieter revolution, perhaps, but one that continues to reshape how we approach our inner lives, particularly for women seeking a more integrated path to peace. You might chuckle at some of the more outlandish claims, but you also recognize the genuine search for solace that drives participation. It's like searching for a perfect playlist to calm your nerves and discovering everything from ancient chants to whale songs. For centuries, many Eastern philosophies and traditional healing practices have understood mental and emotional distress as imbalances within the whole person, not just a problem confined to the brain or specific organs. As Western medicine, despite its advancements, still struggled with the complexities of anxiety, people began to look for alternative paths to inner calm. Yoga, with its blend of physical postures, breathing exercises, and meditation, offers a powerful way to connect with the body and calm the nervous system. Mindfulness, the practice of focusing on the present moment without judgment, provides tools to observe anxious thoughts without becoming overwhelmed by them. You can almost feel the gentle stretch, the deep breath, the quiet observation that these practices encourage. It's like learning to conduct your internal orchestra rather than letting the instruments play wildly out of tune. These approaches offer a different kind of empowerment for women. Instead of being passive recipients of treatment, they become active participants in their own healing, cultivating self-awareness and developing internal resources for managing stress and anxiety. The focus shifts from fixing something broken to cultivating resilience and inner peace through consistent practice. For women who might feel overwhelmed by external pressures or the constant demands of modern life, these practices provide a sanctuary, a space for quiet self-care and profound connection. One quirky or fringe tidbit within this movement is the proliferation of niche holistic therapies. From crystal healing and sound baths to forest bathing and various forms of energy work, historians still argue whether the embrace of holistic approaches is a genuine progression in understanding mental health. As you approach the present moment, you encounter a force that has rapidly reshaped human interaction information dissemination, and, perhaps most profoundly, the landscape of anxiety, social media. Imagine a world where every moment, every achievement, every carefully curated image is broadcast for all to see, creating a relentless, often insidious pressure. This ubiquitous digital presence is a mainstream historical fact, fostering a pervasive comparison culture and introducing entirely new forms of digital anxiety, particularly impacting women. For centuries, women faced pressures to conform to societal ideals. But these ideals were often mediated through limited channels: family, local community, magazines. The very existence of these challenges highlights the profound impact of digital overload on our psychological state. It's like voluntarily going into a sensory deprivation tank just to escape the constant noise of the online world. Social media, however, has amplified this exponentially and exacerbates new forms of distress, fundamentally altering the way women experience and express their mental health. Does it offer valuable connection and community? Or does it primarily foster unhealthy comparison and a relentless pursuit of an unattainable digital ideal? You consider the pervasive, often invisible, ways in which the digital age has woven itself into the fabric of our emotional lives, presenting a new frontier in the ongoing story of anxiety. The wandering womb and the rest cure might seem archaic, but the digital anxieties of today are very real, very present, and still largely uncharted territory. Platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook present an endless scroll of seemingly perfect lives, flawless aesthetics, enviable vacations, successful careers, and picture-perfect families. For women who are often already conditioned to strive for external validation and perfection, this creates an unrelenting environment of comparison. You find yourself constantly measuring your own life, your body, your relationships, and your achievements against the idealized highlights reels of others, often leading to feelings of inadequacy, envy, and profound anxiety. It's like being in a competition where everyone else seems to be winning gold medals, and you're just trying to tie your shoelaces without tripping. The digital realm also introduces unique anxieties: the pressure to maintain an online persona, the fear of missing out, the constant need for validation through likes and comments, and the exposure to cyberbullying or online harassment. Women who often bear the brunt of online scrutiny and gendered abuse, this can be particularly taxing. The boundaries between public and private blur, and the ability to disconnect and truly relax becomes increasingly challenging. Your phone, once a tool for connection, can become a constant source of low-level dread. One quirky or fringe tidbit from this era is the phenomenon of digital detoxes, or unplugging challenges, where individuals intentionally disconnect from social media and technology for a period to reduce anxiety and improve mental well-being. Historians still argue whether social media primarily reflects existing societal anxieties, or if it actively creates. As our journey through the winding history of women's anxiety draws to a close, you now look towards the future outlook, a landscape still evolving, but hopefully guided by lessons learned from centuries of misunderstanding and misdiagnosis. The days of wandering wombs and the rest cure, thankfully, are firmly in the past. There's a concerted effort to move beyond simplistic explanations and towards nuanced understanding, still in its early stages. Imagine a future where a precise diagnostic test could inform the exact medication or therapy that would be most effective for you, minimizing trial and error. Or if it primarily offers individual solutions without fundamentally altering the broader social landscape. Will future generations look back at our current struggles with body image, social media comparison, and work-life balance as quaint relics of an anxious age or as enduring challenges? You consider the ongoing journey a testament to humanity's persistent quest for understanding and healing. We have learned much, but the human mind, in all its complexity, continues to be the greatest mystery, particularly when viewed through the unique lens of female experience. It's like having a bespoke suit made for your brain, perfectly tailored to its unique dimensions. For women, this means a greater likelihood of receiving an accurate diagnosis and a wider range of evidence-based treatments, from targeted therapies like CBT to appropriately prescribed medications, alongside a growing appreciation for holistic and integrative approaches. The conversation is shifting, slowly but surely, from what's wrong with her to how can we best support her. It's like finally moving from trying to fix a broken part with a hammer to using sophisticated diagnostic tools and precise engineering. Imagine a world where mental health is openly discussed, deeply understood, and truly integrated into overall well-being. Free from the lingering shadows of past prejudices, this ongoing process of destigmatization and the development of evolving care represents our current and future trajectory. It's a hopeful counterpoint to the often bleak historical narrative. Today there's a growing mainstream recognition that anxiety is a complex condition with biological, psychological, and social roots. The destigmatization of mental illness is a critical piece of this future. Open conversations by celebrities, public figures, and everyday individuals are slowly chipping away at the shame and silence that once surrounded anxiety and depression. For women, this means less fear of being labeled hysterical or too emotional, and more willingness to seek help. Support groups, online communities, and mental health advocacy initiatives are creating spaces for shared experience and collective healing. This collective voice is a powerful force, eroding the isolation that so often accompanies anxiety. One quirky or fringe tidbit of the emerging future is the exciting, albeit nascent, field of personalized mental health care. Treatments might eventually be tailored to an individual's unique genetic makeup, brain chemistry, and even their gut microbiome. Historians still argue whether our current focus on destigmatization and personalized care will truly address the deep-seated societal inequalities and cultural pressures that continue to disproportionately affect women's mental health. The dim lights of our historical journey now begin to soften, fading slowly into a gentle, calming glow. You've traveled through ancient beliefs and medieval fears, through Victorian strictures and modern complexities, witnessing the many ways women's inner struggles have been interpreted and often misunderstood. The historical burdens, the past anxieties, they are now just stories, settling into the vast, calm archives of your mind. You are here now, safe and still, drifting on the soft currents of tranquility. Let the images and concepts we've explored tonight dissolve, leaving behind only a sense of quiet curiosity and the comforting knowledge of progress. Your breath deepens, a steady, rhythmic cadence. The world outside grows distant, replaced by the soft, enveloping stillness of your own space. There is nothing left to do, nowhere left to be, but here, in this moment of perfect calm, just quiet, peaceful, sleep, the distant echoes of wandering wombs in the quiet. Whir of early vibrators now seem like whispers from a long-forgotten dream. The relentless scroll of social media, too, begins to blur, its sharp edges softening into a gentle hum. Feel the quiet descent of sleep, a peaceful surrender after this long mental exploration.